Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here. Thank you, Milton. Thank you, Zev. It's been a fascinating meeting so far, and I'm now between you and your lunch. I know you're hungry, but I hope to give you an appetite for ethical reflection as well. I'm very glad that James focused so much on outcomes and patient perspectives, because I think one thing that is common to you as clinicians and us as bioethicists is that we really need to think about what matters at the end of the day to patients and to society. And I put this image up first to sort of remind us that at the bottom of everything we do is the desire for a baby, for a family, and for a healthy baby, and to remind us that the people in this situation are vulnerable. Infertility or the concern about disease makes us very vulnerable. So instead of presenting to you today just a sort of survey of ethical concerns related to the work that you do, I wanted to do some bioethics soul searching. I wanted to ask, do we in bioethics do a good job to help those in need, to really promote better outcomes, or can we do better? This is inspired by a talk that Jerry gave last year, where he talked about sort of real science and fake science, and it made me think about real and fake ethics. Are we good at identifying the issues that really matter? But also, beyond just identifying them, do we prioritize them well enough? And do we know how to distinguish the real from the sensationalist ethical preoccupations? And I think we've been sort of doing a good job on the identification plan, but not as well with prioritizing. Now, if we talk about sensationalism, of course, one thing that comes to mind is the very recent international scandal around the announcement that the world's first genetically edited embryos actually were born, the two twins born in November of last year in China. And this received a lot of media attention worldwide. Of course, CRISPR has been getting a lot of attention even previously. It was recognized as breakthrough of the year. But look at some of the reporting here. Eugenics is back. I think it's important to understand that every scientific advancement reported in this room ends up reported in the media and shapes public opinion. And the way the public thinks about these issues is the ways policymakers and decision makers think about the policies that govern the technologies that you all use. So it's critically important how we report this in the scientific literature and in the media. And if we even pick up our program, I just snapped a photo of the scientific program of yesterday, and look at the talk that Monica gave. How would I sell a newspaper with printing a 3D ovary? I would add on, no more need for women, or with a question mark. And then I made it sensationalist, I made it maybe a little bit scary, I highlighted the impact it would have on society in the future, but it's not scientifically founded. We're not there, we're not going there. Or take Sherman's talk, making sperm from skin cells. I would add, no more need for men. So, of course, when our responsible studies are reported by journalists, and I don't want to blame all journalists, some do wonderful, nuanced, and responsible work, but sometimes when we want to sell, not just newspapers, but when we want to get funded, when we want our grants funded, we hype up the implications of the science. And my concern is that we sometimes also hype the ethics. This is a paper from my good friend and a great colleague, Tim Caulfield, who tried to show that in bioethics we also suffer from this phenomenon of hype, and call us to try and refrain from it. So what is ethics hype? It's when our ethics debates are informed more by speculation of harm and anecdote than by available evidence. It's when we exaggerate concerns or when we pay attention to things that are not a priority, that shouldn't be a priority. And I know everything I say here is complex and need to be unpacked, but we have lunch, so let me just present some thoughts and we can continue to discuss over lunch. What is wrong with hype? I think it draws public, media, and political attention to the wrong issues. It pushes us to look at sexy topics that sell news and, as I said, get us the grants, but not most important or urgent for patients, clinicians, and policymakers. It wastes our energy, and it may result in neglecting important issues. So we all have limited time and resources for the science or for the bioethics, and I think if we focus on what's not a priority, we neglect important points. My bottom line for you today is a call for clinicians and ethicists to focus on what matters, and a call for responsible and informative media reporting in order to shape public debate and to shape policy. But let me give you two historical examples, and then a third example that brings us to the present and into the future. My first historical example is the introduction of IVF itself. And as you know, it has been taking the fun out of procreation for decades now. And a quick quiz, who is this? Of course, this crowd knows. So this is the world's first IVF baby. Here she is at her birth with her parents in England. And look at the title of the news title that accompanied her birth. So she was called a Testtube baby, super babe. And of course, the concept, the term Testtube babies, threw public imagination in the direction of life that is artificial, that is not natural, that is accompanied by great risk. At the time, the initial reactions to her birth were really focused on the challenge that in vitro conception posed to our social intuitions and norms. There were religious objections, there still are, and I would say there were knee-jerk reactions. But if we fast forward 40 years, look at the newspaper titles when she was last year celebrating her 40th birthday. So, happy birthday, 8 million more and counting. So of course IVF has become so acceptable socially that we don't even recognize an ethical issue inherent in its use. Here she is with who? Of course. Who actually received a Nobel Prize in 2010 for the role he played in IVF. So we're living now in a world with millions and millions of children born this way. Looking back, did we have the correct, did we pay attention to the appropriate concerns? And if we did, what was neglected? What issues at the time we should have paid attention to and didn't? Let me throw two topics: cost and access. How little have we been thinking, and I'm thinking about the bioethics literature, about the barrier of cost to the access of so many people who need fertility treatment to these technologies. So, I'm sorry I spent your entire college fund trying to conceive you. This is the reality for many people. In many countries, there's no public funding. It ends up being a technology available to those who are well off. Have we been dedicating enough attention to the policy debates around public funding of IVF? I think we haven't. Another issue we have neglected back then: longitudinal studies on implications of IVF for future health and risks for women and children. We are now beginning to learn about the long-term effects of ovarian stimulation, of being conceived in vitro. But we could have had much better data if we had started collecting it 40 years ago. We started thinking about this late in the game. This could have been the work of bioethicists to push this agenda, to bring this to the attention of clinicians and policymakers. So we missed an opportunity, and we're paying now because we don't have good data for egg donors, for those going through IVF, and for the millions of children that we have created. So I'm going back to my point: if we focus on what's not a priority, we neglect something. And let me give you a second example from gamete donation. Initially, of course, when we started using sperm and then egg donation, the focus for clinicians was on achieving a pregnancy. And that's why I really liked the previous speaker's focus on just achieving a pregnancy is not an outcome from the perspective of the patient, right? Who here knew Luigi Mastroianni? Bunch. So I had the great fortune of collaborating with him when I was at UPenn, and we talked about sperm donation once, and I told him, you know, Luigi, people now really care about knowing the identity of their donors. And he said, why? I said, well, it really matters to them. His reaction was, oh, baloney, which was very typical of him. So I think there was a lack of not just understanding, but thought about the implications of what we're doing for the actual children who will be born at the end of this. It was like, we achieved a pregnancy, we solved the problem of infertility, yay, that's what we were after. But these children were born in the hundreds of thousands, and they grew up and they started telling us something different. They said, I need to know my genetic origins. The anonymity of my donor is an issue for me, medically, psychologically, socially. Where are the registries that you should have created to allow me to connect to my donor, but also to other children created by the same donor? We don't have such registries. We don't keep this information enough years for children to, for the adults to access it. Where were the bioethicists when it was time to think about this in the early days? Why didn't we focus on what mattered for the outcomes for patients? So let me introduce to you a new concept. Children conceived by the same donor but raised in different families are now finding each other online through private registries, through DNA testing, commercial DNA testing. They find each other and they form a new type of familial relationship. They call themselves diblings, for donor siblings, and they actually create relationships that matter to them. And if one of them is diagnosed with a hereditary disease, they inform each other. So this has medical advantages and psychological advantages. We didn't think about this. This was not an outcome that we paid attention to, and we should have. So in introducing IVF, we neglected access and longitudinal follow-up. In gamete donation, we neglected the medical and identity needs of donor-conceived people. And I'm asking you, what are we neglecting now? What kind of attention are we giving emerging technologies today, and what should we be thinking about that we're not thinking about enough? And again, this is really a bioethics soul-searching moment. I'm sort of exposing my area of study before you to think, how can we do better? And I'm going back to Dr. Hay and the very recent scandal, because I have to tell you, when this exploded a year ago, for about 2 weeks, I got calls from journalists 10 times a day. I had to put my work aside and give interviews for an entire week, from morning till night. And you know what they all wanted to talk about? Guess, the one thing every journalist brought up in their first sentence. Designer babies. CRISPR gene editing, what is our major concern? That this will allow us to go into the human DNA and design our babies. And this will be a new society in which parents pick the traits of their children. So anything from eye color to just a selection of traits that have nothing to do with disease. And children will become products. And oh my God. And I like this cartoon because it really captures what is communicated to the public when we use this term, designer babies, and we actually sort of sell a future in which people will go to a baby store and pick what their child will actually be. So am I paying here for a tech tycoon or for a tax lawyer or why do I call this ethics hype? And not only have no base in science today, this will never be possible. Because, of course, the traits that might promote a certain personality or a certain area of interest are complex. There are many genes involved. There's gene-gene interaction, gene-environment interaction. There's the environment, non-biological environment the child will be raised in. shaping public fears and perception based on this image is just scientifically unfounded and will never be. But this is what the journalists want to talk about, this is what drives policy statements, and this will eventually limit our use of the technology if we keep talking about it in this way. So what should we focus on? And I'll leave you with this thought. I think our focus should be on what matters and what is urgent, what uses are ethically appropriate and socially acceptable, not just for CRISPR in the future, but right now for prenatal testing, for NIPT, for PGD or T. NIPT allows us to test earlier in the pregnancy without a risk of miscarriage, and it's going fast towards whole exome. What do we want to check? What do we want to report to patients? How is everybody going to deal with the avalanche of information? How do we prioritize what conditions we target first? How do we responsibly expand the packages that we provide to patients during pregnancy or in vitro in the PGD context? And in the future, what do we use CRISPR for? What genes are we going to target? Do you remember what Dr. Hay targeted? Which gene he modified in those twins? CCR5, he confirmed, he gave them immunity to HIV. Is that urgent? Is that what we wanted CRISPR to be used for the first time? They were not going to be born sick. Was it enhancement? Was it prevention? Was it appropriate? The Russian guy who is now trying to get approval for the second CRISPR baby, which gene is he wanting to target? Deafness. Is that a priority? Is that appropriate, acceptable? My point is that this is what we should be talking about. Many policy statements and clinical guidelines rely on the concept of a serious condition in order to justify use. So we're told if we're ever ready to use germline gene editing, we should only target serious conditions. But what does that mean? And this is a question we have been neglecting. We just throw serious or severe out there in many policy and clinical guidelines, and we haven't started, and that's our job as bioethicists, to explore what it means clinically, socially, ethically. I'm sharing with you, I took this out of a paper my team recently published on the future of PGD, but again, it applies across the board to many technologies. And in this table, we try to just begin to tease out what could be the potential meaning of serious. Based on what are we going to choose, what conditions, what genes we should pay attention to. And look at the complexity here. Morbidity, mortality, quality of life. What is quality of life? That in itself is one of the most complex issues in bioethics. Level of penetrance, level of risk, age of onset, availability of treatment, cost of treatment. How do we even classify this? Is it a disease? Is it a disability? Is it ethically appropriate to target disabilities? What is the nature of the condition? Is it physical, mental, cognitive? And when we think about the context, the familial context, what about the ability or willingness to care for the child? The availability of alternatives. So when we just throw the term serious out there as a magical solution to what should we target, we haven't done a good job. And there is so much that we need to think about. So in conclusion, on this specific point, going forward, we have much conceptual work to do to clarify what we mean when we say we should first target serious conditions, and focusing academic and public attention on things such as designer babies to frame our thinking and our debate is not productive. And my more general conclusion is, let's have a responsible, informative, evidence-based debate about the ethics of current and emerging reproductive technologies, and let's prioritize the issues we tackle to address the most urgent first, because as I said, what matters at the end of the day is to do well for our patients and for society. And I leave you with my own genetically edited baby. Thank you.